Welcome to Land of Horror, where horror stories come to life like never before. In today's video, we will explore chilling true events, unsolved mysteries, and the fears lurking in the shadows. From bone-chilling murder cases to supernatural phenomena that defy all explanation, each story will take you on a journey filled with tension and suspense. You will hear about real individuals who have faced terrifying moments, life and death situations, and discoveries that send chills down anyone's spine. Prepare yourself for moments of anxiety and thrills, because these stories aren't just fiction, but the dark truths of life. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications to join us in uncovering even more horrifying mysteries.
It was the spring of 1946 in Texarkana, a small border town straddling Texas and Arkansas. The town, bathed in the warmth of the southern sun, was the picture of tranquility. Children played in the streets, neighbors chatted over fences, and couples strolled hand in hand through the parks. The war had ended the year before, and while some men were still abroad or slowly making their way home, life seemed to be returning to a normal pace. However, the uneasy remnants of war still lingered in the air. Emma Cartwright was a 20-year-old girl with bright red hair that seemed to reflect the evening sun. She had lived her entire life in Texarkana, knew every street, every face. Her father was a respected local business owner, running the general store that had been in the family for generations. That evening, she had plans with Jack Turner, her boyfriend of a few months. Jack was tall, lean, and always had a smirk playing on his lips. He had a rebellious streak, which only added to his charm in Emma's eyes. They had decided to take a drive out to one of the popular lovers' lanes just outside of town, a secluded spot on a dirt road lined with tall pine trees, where the sky opened up in a sea of stars, and the only sound was the chirping of crickets. It was a place young couples often went to escape the watchful eyes of their parents and steal a few moments of privacy. Jack pulled his beat-up Chevrolet off the road and into the clearing. The car's headlights cast long shadows across the trees before he turned the engine off. As the silence of the night enveloped them, the air felt cool against Emma's skin, a relief from the heat of the day. She rolled down the window slightly, letting the cool breeze in. They sat there in comfortable silence for a while, just watching the stars flicker in the dark sky. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" Jack said, his voice low and relaxed. Emma nodded, leaning her head back against the seat, enjoying the calm. "Yeah, it is. So peaceful out here." They talked for a while, laughing softly, sharing stories about friends and family. Jack, always the joker, made Emma laugh with his exaggerated impressions of people they knew. The world outside their small car felt a million miles away, and for a moment, everything was perfect. But then, there was a sound, a sharp, distinct noise that made Emma sit up straight. It was faint, but it echoed through the quiet night. It wasn't the wind, nor was it the rustling of the leaves. It was something more unnatural, more deliberate. Jack noticed her shift in posture. "What's wrong? Did you hear that?" Emma asked, her eyes scanning the tree line. Jack shrugged, a cocky smile on his face. "Probably just a raccoon or something. We're out in the woods, Em. You're going to hear strange noises." Emma tried to laugh it off, but something about that sound had unsettled her. She couldn't put her finger on it, but it sent a chill down her spine. She looked out into the dark trees, their silhouettes forming menacing shapes in the distance. There was no movement, no sign of life, just an eerie stillness. A few minutes passed, and Emma began to relax again. Jack leaned in closer, whispering sweet nothings in her ear, his hand brushing against her cheek. But just as her heart began to race for a different reason, another sound interrupted the night, this time much louder. Thump. It was the sound of something heavy hitting metal. Emma jumped in her seat, her breath catching in her throat. Jack turned sharply toward the noise, his playful demeanor now replaced by a look of confusion. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, his eyes narrowing as he peered out the window. Before Emma could respond, there was another thump, this one even closer. It came from right outside Jack's door. Both of them froze, their eyes locked on each other for a tense moment. The fear in Emma's chest was now a full-blown panic. "Jack, let's go," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, let's just go." Jack hesitated for a second, clearly trying to assess the situation. He wasn't the type to scare easily, and his pride wouldn't let him drive off without figuring out what was causing the noise. But something about the look in Emma's eyes made him pause. All right, he muttered. He reached for the keys in the ignition, but before he could turn them, there was a loud bang on the driver's side window. Emma screamed. Jack jerked back in his seat, his eyes wide with shock as he stared at the figure standing just outside the car. A man, or at least it appeared to be a man, stood there, dressed in dark, dirty clothes. His face was obscured by a crude mask made from a burlap sack, with 2 small holes cut out. The mask was stained with dirt and what looked like dried blood. His breathing was heavy, audible even through the glass, and he stood there, motionless, like a predator stalking his prey. Jack's hand fumbled for the door handle, but before he could open it, the figure raised his arm. In his hand was a long, gleaming revolver. Everything happened in a blur. The car's windows shattered as the gun fired. Emma's scream was lost in the chaos as Jack slumped forward, blood splattering across the windshield. The deafening noise of the gunshots echoed in Emma's ears, but all she could focus on was Jack's lifeless body next to her, his eyes wide open in shock, blood pooling beneath him. Her instincts took over. She scrambled to unlock the passenger door, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The world around her was spinning, her vision blurred by tears. She could hear footsteps coming closer, slow, deliberate. Finally, she managed to push the door open and stumbled out into the night. Her legs felt weak, but adrenaline pushed her forward. She ran, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might explode. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get as far away as possible. The trees around her seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Her feet pounded against the dirt, but every step felt like she was sinking deeper into the earth. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her lungs burning. Behind her, she could hear him, the man with the burlap mask, his footsteps heavy and unhurried. He didn't need to run. He knew she wouldn't get far. Emma tripped over a root, crashing to the ground. Pain shot through her ankle as she twisted it, but she forced herself to get up. She couldn't stop now, not when he was so close. The thought of what he might do if he caught her was enough to make her push through the pain. The clearing was up ahead. If she could just make it to the road, maybe someone would find her. Maybe she could get help. But as she limped forward, she felt something hard and cold press against the back of her head. "Don't move," a voice rasped. It was low, almost inhuman. Emma's blood turned to ice. She closed her eyes, her body trembling uncontrollably as she waited for the inevitable. The cold barrel of the gun pressed harder against her skull, and she held her breath. But then, there was a strange sound, distant but growing louder. A car. Someone was coming. The man hesitated, and in that split second, Emma's survival instincts kicked in again. She twisted her body, knocking his arm aside, and ran toward the road, screaming for help with all the strength she had left. Headlights appeared on the horizon. The man cursed behind her, but he didn't follow. Instead, he melted back into the trees, disappearing into the night like a shadow. Emma collapsed on the side of the road as the car screeched to a halt beside her. A middle-aged couple jumped out, rushing to her aid. She could barely speak, her words slurred by shock and exhaustion. but she managed to tell them about Jack, about the man with the mask. Within minutes, police cars were speeding toward the lovers' lane, but by the time they arrived, the killer was long gone. Jack's body lay slumped in the driver's seat, the blood-soaked remnants of a young life cut short. Texarkana would never be the same. The tranquil town of Texarkana was still reeling from the brutal attack on Jack and Emma. Word of the horrific crime spread like wildfire. The once peaceful streets were now filled with whispers of fear and speculation. People spoke of a masked man who appeared from the shadows, striking like a phantom in the night, then disappearing without a trace. It was as though the town itself was being haunted by an unseen, malevolent force. The police, overwhelmed and under pressure, had little to go on. They interviewed Emma repeatedly, hoping that her memory would hold some clue, some detail that might lead them to the killer. But the trauma of that night had fogged her recollections. She could only recall the man's dark clothes, the crude burlap mask, and the glint of the gun in his hand. The rest was a blur of terror and blood. The town waited anxiously for the next move. And it didn't take long for the killer to strike again. A few weeks after the attack on Emma and Jack, a second couple was found dead at another secluded lover's lane on the edge of town. This time, there were no survivors. Alex and Laura had been high school sweethearts, the kind of couple that everyone in town adored. Alex was a star football player with a scholarship to a university in Dallas, and Laura was the girl next door, always smiling and full of life. They had been inseparable since their freshman year, and everyone assumed they would get married one day. That night, they had driven out to the same stretch of road where Emma and Jack had been attacked. It was a quiet, moonlit evening, and like many young couples, they sought a bit of privacy, away from the prying eyes of the town. They never came home. The next morning, when Alex's mother hadn't heard from him, she called Laura's parents. After confirming that neither of the teens had returned, the families began to panic. By noon, a search party was organized, and it wasn't long before a farmer, who had been driving along a dirt road near his property, stumbled upon the grisly scene. The car was parked at an odd angle, its doors wide open. The windows were shattered, and blood covered the seats. Alex was slumped over the steering wheel, his face pale and lifeless. He had been shot twice in the chest at point-blank range. Laura's body was found a few feet from the car, half covered by brush. She had tried to run, but didn't get far, before the killer shot her in the back. The coroner would later determine that she had died instantly. The brutal killing sent shockwaves through Texarkana. For the second time in less than a month, a young couple had been gunned down in a place that was supposed to be safe. The sense of security that had once enveloped the town was shattered. People were no longer willing to believe that these murders were isolated incidents. There was a pattern emerging, and it was terrifying. As the town came to grips with the horror of the second attack, fear began to take hold in earnest. The Texarkana Gazette ran front-page headlines warning citizens to stay indoors after dark and to avoid the secluded areas where the murders had taken place. The police enforced a strict curfew, but despite their best efforts, the killer remained elusive. People began to barricade themselves in their homes, setting up makeshift security systems with pots and pans tied to strings that would jingle if anyone approached their doors. Guns were suddenly in high demand, and even those who had never owned a firearm before were now sleeping with loaded pistols under their pillows. Men stood guard outside their homes, while their wives and children huddled inside, too afraid to sleep. For the first time in its history, Texarkana was gripped by mass paranoia. Some families packed up and left town altogether, unwilling to risk staying in a place where a killer stalked the night. Those who couldn't leave lived in a constant state of unease. Friends and neighbors who had once shared easy conversations over backyard fences now avoided eye contact, their minds consumed by the question that hung in the air: who will be next? The police worked tirelessly, But the killer seemed to always be one step ahead. Every clue led to a dead end. Every witness had seen nothing of value. The only common thread was the killer's methodical precision and his choice of victims, young couples parked in isolated areas. It was as if he enjoyed hunting them, playing a cruel game of cat and mouse with the police and the people of Texarkana. Each murder only heightened the sense of dread that had settled over the town. The newspapers had begun calling him the Phantom Killer, a name that struck fear into the hearts of everyone in the town. It was as though the killer was some spectral figure, impossible to catch, leaving no trace behind except for the bodies of his victims. The name fit the growing sense of helplessness that gripped the town. The Phantom Killer's attacks were not random. They were calculated. He seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to avoid detection. The police had set up roadblocks, organized nightly patrols, and even brought in outside investigators to assist with the case, but nothing worked. The killer was like a ghost, appearing out of nowhere, striking quickly, and vanishing before anyone could respond. The people of Texarkana began to believe that they were dealing with something far more sinister than a mere human being. Whispers of the Phantom's origin spread like wildfire. Some said he was a vengeful spirit, the embodiment of death itself. Others believed he was a madman, but one with military training, capable of outwitting even the most skilled law enforcement officers. The truth, however, remained elusive. By the time the third attack occurred, Texarkana was in a state of collective hysteria. The Phantom Killer had become a boogeyman, lurking in every shadow, haunting every dark corner of the town. People lived in constant fear, afraid to go out after dark, afraid to leave their homes unguarded. The third victims were a couple in their early 20s, James and Peggy. They had been married for only a few months, and were still in the honeymoon phase of their relationship. Like the others, they had driven out to a secluded spot, away from the prying eyes of the town, to enjoy each other's company in the quiet of the night. But the Phantom was waiting. The attack on James and Peggy was even more brutal than the previous ones. Their bodies were found the next morning by a group of teenagers who had been hiking in the woods. James had been shot multiple times, his body left slumped against the front of the car. Peggy had been dragged from the vehicle and stabbed repeatedly, her face and hands covered in defensive wounds. It was clear that she had fought desperately for her life, but the Phantom had been too strong, too relentless. The sheer savagery of the murders left the town reeling. The Phantom was no longer just a killer, he was a monster, and he was growing bolder with each attack. The police, desperate for any lead, began questioning everyone in town. No one was above suspicion. They combed through records, interrogated suspects, and conducted house-to-house searches. But the killer remained elusive. The sense of helplessness that had gripped the town deepened. It seemed as though the Phantom could strike at any time, in any place, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop him. Texarkana was now a town on the edge of collapse. Businesses closed early, families locked themselves inside as soon as the sun set, and the once lively streets were now eerily silent after dark. The sense of community that had once defined the town had been replaced by suspicion and fear. Neighbors no longer trusted one another, and even friends began to look at each other with suspicion. The police held town meetings, urging people to remain calm and assuring them that they were doing everything in their power to catch the killer. But their words did little to ease the growing panic. People demanded answers, but there were none to give. At night, the sound of footsteps or a rustle in the bushes would send entire households into a frenzy. Guns were fired at shadows, and the police were called out to investigate what always turned out to be nothing. The killer had managed to turn the entire town into a powder keg, ready to explode at any moment. With each passing day, the pressure on the police to catch the Phantom grew more intense. The local police force, under the leadership of Sheriff Bill Mason, had been working around the clock, but they were running out of options. The Texas Rangers had been called in to assist, and even the FBI had taken an interest in the case. Sheriff Mason was a no-nonsense man, tough and experienced, but even he was beginning to feel the strain. The Phantom had managed to outsmart them at every turn, leaving behind no clues, no witnesses, no fingerprints. It was as if he was taunting them, daring them to catch him. In an effort to break the case, Mason decided to bring in one of the best investigators in the state, Ranger Thomas Anderson. Anderson was a seasoned lawman, known for his keen instincts and ability to get inside the mind of a killer. He had solved some of the toughest cases in Texas, and Mason hoped that his expertise would be the key to catching the Phantom. Anderson arrived in Texarkana with a quiet confidence that immediately put the townspeople at ease. He didn't make any grand promises or boast about his abilities, but there was something about his calm demeanor that made people believe that he could solve the case. Anderson's first order of business was to re-examine everything the local police had gathered so far. He pored over the crime scene photos, the autopsy reports, and the witness statements. He spent hours interviewing Emma, trying to piece together any small detail she might have missed in her earlier interviews. As Anderson delved deeper into the case, he began to form a theory. The Phantom's attacks were methodical, almost military in their precision. He struck quickly, killed with brutal efficiency, and left no trace of himself behind. Anderson suspected that the killer had some form of military training, perhaps a former soldier who had returned home after the war with a taste for violence. The idea that the Phantom might be someone who had once served their country, someone who lived among them, sent a fresh wave of fear through Texarkana. It meant that the killer could be anyone, a neighbor, a friend, even a family member. Anderson kept this theory to himself for the time being, not wanting to further inflame the town's already fragile state. Instead, he focused on gathering more evidence, following every lead, no matter how small. But as the days turned into weeks, and the killer remained at large, Anderson began to realize that this case might be more complicated than he had initially thought. The Phantom was no ordinary killer. He was smart, cunning, and seemed to be enjoying the fear and chaos he was creating. Just when the town had begun to hope that the worst was over, the Phantom struck again. This time, his victims were Betty and Charles, a young couple who had recently gotten engaged. They had been planning their wedding for months and were excited about starting their new life together. But the Phantom had other plans. Their bodies were found in the early hours of the morning, just outside the town limits. Like the others, they had been shot at close range, their car riddled with bullet holes. Betty had tried to flee, but the killer had caught up with her, his knife leaving deep gashes across her arms and back. Charles had been killed instantly, a single bullet to the head ending his life. The sheer brutality of the attack sent shockwaves through Texarkana. The Phantom had escalated his violence, and the town was now in a state of full-blown panic. The once quiet streets were now patrolled by armed citizens, and even the local government was discussing the possibility of calling in the National Guard to help restore order. But despite the increased police presence, the Phantom remained elusive. He seemed to strike whenever and wherever he pleased, leaving behind only death and destruction in his wake. By now, Texarkana was a town completely fractured by fear. The sense of community that had once defined it was gone, replaced by suspicion, anger, and desperation. People were no longer just afraid of the Phantom. They were afraid of each other. Rumors began to circulate that the killer might be someone within the police force itself, or perhaps a well-respected member of the community who had gone mad. Everyone was a suspect, and no one was safe. At night, the once lively bars and diners were now empty, their lights turned off as soon as the sun set. Families huddled together in their homes, listening for any sign that the Phantom might be near. The town had become a place of ghosts, haunted not just by the killer, who stalked the night, but by the memories of the lives he had destroyed. With each new attack, the phantom seemed to grow bolder, more confident in his ability to evade capture. But Anderson knew that the killer's arrogance would eventually be his downfall. As the investigation dragged on, Anderson began to notice a pattern in the phantom's movements. The killer wasn't just striking at random. He was following a carefully planned route, choosing his victims based on their proximity to certain landmarks. It was as if he was playing a game, marking his territory with blood. Anderson realized that the killer had a twisted sense of control, and that control was the key to catching him. In a bold move, Anderson decided to set a trap. He convinced the local police to stage a mock lover's lane scenario, using undercover officers as bait. The hope was that the phantom would be drawn to the scene, unable to resist the urge to strike again. For days, the police waited in silence, watching and waiting for the phantom to take the bait. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. And then, just when they thought the killer might have slipped through their fingers once again, he appeared. It happened so quickly that the officers almost didn't believe their eyes. The phantom stepped out of the shadows, his gun raised, ready to strike. But this time, he had walked into a trap. The police moved in swiftly, surrounding the killer before he had a chance to react. The phantom fired his gun wildly, but it was too late. Within seconds, he was disarmed, tackled to the ground, and handcuffed. As the police pulled the burlap mask from his face, the town held its collective breath, waiting to see the identity of the man who had terrorized them for so long. To their shock, the phantom was someone they all knew, a quiet, unassuming man who had lived among them for years. No one had suspected him, and yet he had been right there all along, hiding in plain sight. The arrest of the phantom killer brought a sense of relief to Texarkana, but the scars he had left behind would never fully heal. The town had been forever changed by the fear and violence that had gripped it for months. As the killer was led away in handcuffs, the people of Texarkana knew that they would never forget the terror that had stalked their streets, nor the lives that had been lost to the phantom in the night. The capture of the phantom killer had brought a temporary sense of relief to Texarkana, but the aftermath of the trial revealed unsettling truths that would continue to haunt the town. With the killer behind bars, the community was left grappling with the emotional and psychological scars of his brutal reign of terror. Yet, as the trial approached, it became evident that the story was far from over. The trial of the phantom killer, whose real name was revealed to be Charlie Harris, captured the attention of not just Texarkana, but the entire nation. The media descended upon the town like vultures, eager to cover every sordid detail of the case. Reporters camped out in front of the courthouse, and the trial became a spectacle, drawing crowds of onlookers who wanted to see the man who had terrorized their community. As the proceedings began, the atmosphere was tense. The courtroom was packed with victims' families, reporters, and curious townsfolk, all eager to hear the testimony of the man responsible for the deaths of their loved ones. Sheriff Mason and Ranger Anderson sat in the front row, the weight of their responsibility heavy on their shoulders. The prosecution laid out their case methodically, presenting evidence that painted a picture of a calculating and ruthless killer. They recounted the chilling details of each murder, highlighting the methodical nature of the crimes. The prosecution also presented forensic evidence, tying Harris to the crime scenes through ballistics and fingerprints. But as the defense presented its case, a different narrative began to emerge. Harris's attorney argued that he was a victim of circumstance, a man who had been driven to madness by the horrors of war. He painted Harris as a troubled soul who had returned from combat scarred and broken, unable to reintegrate into society. The defense claimed that the true killer was still out there, suggesting that the authorities had arrested the wrong man. The trial divided the community. While many were convinced of Harris's guilt, others began to question whether the police had rushed to judgment, fueled by the panic that had gripped Texarkana. The defense's narrative resonated with some, leading to debates in homes and local diners about the true nature of justice. The fear that had enveloped the town during the killings reemerged, as whispers circulated that the real phantom killer might still be at large. The trial became a flashpoint for old grievances, with townspeople arguing over their safety and the ability of law enforcement to protect them. Amid the turmoil, Emma, the only survivor of the initial attack, found herself thrust into the spotlight. She had been called to testify, and her courage to face her attacker brought both admiration and scrutiny. Emma struggled with her emotions, haunted by memories of that fateful night. When Emma took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She spoke slowly, each word heavy with emotion, recounting the horror of her attack. The eyes of the audience were glued to her, some filled with empathy, while others watched with suspicion, unsure of how to reconcile her testimony with the defense's claims. As she spoke, the room was filled with a palpable tension. Emma described the moment Harris had entered the car, the gun in his hand, the terror that washed over her. She detailed her fear for Jack, her boyfriend, and how she had fought to save him. Her testimony was raw and emotional, revealing not just the physical trauma she had endured, but the lasting psychological impact the attack had left on her. However, the defense was prepared. They cross-examined Emma ruthlessly, attempting to chip away at her credibility. They focused on minor inconsistencies in her account, suggesting that her memory had been altered by the trauma she had suffered. Emma fought back, determined to maintain her truth, but the questioning left her shaken. The prosecution and defense battled back and forth, each side painting a vastly different picture of Harris. The town watched with bated breath, unsure of who to believe, as the trial began to resemble a soap opera more than a quest for justice. As the trial progressed, surprising revelations began to emerge. The prosecution had obtained new evidence that suggested Harris was not acting alone. Reports surfaced of a mysterious figure seen in the vicinity of the murders, someone who had been surveilling the couples in the lovers' lanes. This revelation sent shockwaves through the community, reigniting fears that the true phantom killer might still be out there. Anderson, who had been investigating the case diligently, decided to delve deeper into this new lead. He began interviewing witnesses again, searching for anyone who might have seen something unusual during the time of the murders. His persistence paid off when he discovered a woman who had seen a suspicious vehicle parked near one of the crime scenes on the night of the last attack. This woman had reported the vehicle to the police, but her statement had been lost in the chaos of the investigation. The vehicle description matched a car owned by a local man, known for his erratic behavior and history of violence. Anderson shared this information with Sheriff Mason, and the two men agreed that they needed to bring this individual in for questioning. They hoped that this new lead would finally bring the case closer to resolution. As Anderson and Mason began tracking down the man, tensions in Texarkana escalated. Fear of a second phantom killer fueled paranoia, and the townspeople began to prepare for the worst. Vigilante groups formed, patrolling the streets at night, and the sense of safety that had returned after Harris's arrest began to slip away. The police located the man, a man named Frank Caldwell, living in a dilapidated trailer on the outskirts of town. He was known to be reclusive, spending most of his time alone, but there were whispers that he had a violent streak. The sheriff and ranger approached the trailer cautiously, knowing that this could either be the breakthrough they needed or a dangerous confrontation. When they knocked, Caldwell opened the door, his expression unreadable. As they began questioning him, Caldwell's demeanor shifted from passive to aggressive. He denied any involvement in the murders, claiming he had been home the entire time. But there was something in his eyes, an unease that suggested he was hiding something. As the questioning intensified, Caldwell grew more defensive, and suddenly he lashed out. He claimed that he was being unfairly targeted, that the police were trying to pin the murders on him to cover up their own incompetence. The encounter escalated quickly, and Caldwell's paranoia became evident. Anderson recognized that they were getting nowhere. They decided to leave, but as they stepped outside, Caldwell shouted after them, "You'll never catch him! He's one of you!" His words hung in the air like a threat, deepening the mystery surrounding the murders. Caldwell's accusation sent shockwaves through the community. It reignited the belief that there was a network of killers, hiding in plain sight, evading capture while the police struggled to maintain order. Town meetings were held, fueled by fear and frustration, as citizens demanded answers. The tension reached a boiling point, and residents began to accuse one another, convinced that their neighbors could be harboring secrets. Emma, caught in the eye of the storm, found herself overwhelmed by the pressure. She had tried to be a symbol of resilience for the town, but as the trial dragged on and fear took hold again, she started to question her own safety. The weight of the past was heavy, and memories of that night were never far from her mind. Feeling isolated, Emma sought solace in therapy, trying to make sense of her trauma. In her sessions, she began to unravel layers of her emotions, confronting the fear that had taken root in her heart. Her therapist encouraged her to channel her experience into something positive, advocacy for other survivors of violence. This became her mission, and she began to speak out, sharing her story in hopes of helping others. As Emma's resolve strengthened, she found herself at the center of a new initiative aimed at supporting survivors in Texarkana. The community began to rally around her, uniting to reclaim their sense of safety and security. Emma's strength became an inspiration, leading many to confront their fears and support one another. While Emma was working to heal the community, Anderson and Mason continued their investigation into Caldwell and the possibility of a second killer. They uncovered disturbing information about Caldwell's past, a series of violent altercations, and a troubling obsession with the local news coverage of the murders. It was clear that he was a deeply troubled individual, but did he have any connection to the killings? As they continued to dig, they learned that Caldwell had a disturbing fascination with Charlie Harris. He had often been seen lurking around the courthouse during the trial, watching the proceedings with a twisted interest. The pieces began to fall into place, and Anderson suspected that Caldwell had been inspired by Harris, perhaps even collaborating with him. The sheriff and ranger decided to confront Caldwell one last time, armed with the new evidence they had gathered. They needed to get to the bottom of this mystery, and ensure that Texarkana was safe once and for all. That night, as they approached Caldwell's trailer once more, they felt the weight of the town's fears on their shoulders. They knocked, but this time, there was no response. The door creaked open, and the two men stepped inside, their senses on high alert. The trailer was dark, the air thick with a sense of dread. As they moved through the cramped space, they discovered a makeshift shrine dedicated to the Phantom Killer, complete with clippings from newspapers and photographs of the victims. Caldwell's obsession had morphed into something monstrous, a twisted homage to violence that sent chills down their spines. Suddenly, a noise from the back of the trailer startled them. They rushed toward the sound, only to find Caldwell, his eyes wild with desperation. He held a gun in his hand, a look of madness on his face. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice trembling. "You'll never take me alive. I'll show you what real fear is." Anderson and Mason tried to reason with him, but Caldwell was beyond listening. He fired a shot into the air, and the chaos that followed felt like a scene from a nightmare. They ducked for cover as Caldwell moved erratically, the gun shaking in his grip. Realizing they had to act fast, Anderson devised a plan. He and Mason flanked Caldwell, using the shadows of the trailer to their advantage. Caldwell was so consumed by his rage that he didn't notice them approaching until it was too late. In a tense standoff, Anderson managed to wrestle the gun from Caldwell's grip, but not before the man's anger spilled over. Caldwell fought back, the two men grappling for control. Mason rushed in to help, and together they subdued Caldwell, handcuffing him before he could harm anyone else. As they pulled Caldwell to his feet, the madness faded from his eyes, leaving only a hollow shell of the man who had once lived among them. He was taken into custody, his plans to instill fear thwarted. With Caldwell behind bars, the sense of relief that washed over Texarkana was palpable. The community had survived yet another storm, but the scars remained. Emma continued her advocacy work, helping to organize support groups for survivors and encouraging conversations about violence and safety in the town. The trial of Charlie Harris continued, but the fear that had gripped Texarkana began to dissipate. The community came together, sharing their stories, reclaiming their streets, and vowing to honor the memories of those who had lost their lives to the violence that had once consumed them. Anderson and Mason stood side by side, reflecting on the trials they had faced. They knew that the battle was far from over, but they felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had witnessed the resilience of their town, the strength of its people, and the importance of coming together in the face of darkness. As the sun set over Texarkana, the shadows that once loomed so large began to fade. The community was no longer defined by fear. It was defined by strength, unity, and the determination to create a safer future for all its residents. As the dust settled in Texarkana after the arrest of Frank Caldwell, the community began to find its footing once more. However, the wounds inflicted by the phantom killer and his possible accomplice were far from healed. The lingering trauma and unresolved questions cast long shadows over the town. With summer giving way to fall, a sense of unease hung in the air, like a fog that refused to lift. The trial of Charlie Harris continued, drawing national attention and a steady stream of media coverage. The testimonies of the survivors, particularly Emma's, had captured the hearts of many across the country, bringing to light the horrifying realities of violence against innocent people. But for Emma, the ongoing trial was a double-edged sword. While she sought to empower others through her advocacy, reliving her trauma in the public eye was draining. Despite her efforts to push through, Emma often found herself haunted by nightmares of the attack. Images of that night invaded her dreams. Harris's cold eyes, the echo of gunfire, the desperate struggle to survive. Each night, she would wake in a cold sweat, her heart racing, struggling to remind herself that she was safe now. But deep down, she feared that the shadows of the past would never fully release their grip on her. To cope, Emma sought therapy and began attending support groups, finding solace among others who had experienced violence. She became a vocal advocate for victims' rights, participating in discussions about safety in the community and leading initiatives to create awareness around domestic violence and sexual assault. But even as she stood tall in front of her peers, the internal battle raged on. Meanwhile, Sheriff Mason and Ranger Anderson were still grappling with the implications of Caldwell's arrest. Though Caldwell had been linked to the phantom killer's crimes, they could not shake the feeling that something larger loomed over Texarkana. The true extent of the violence that had plagued their town was beginning to emerge, and they feared that Caldwell's actions were only a small part of a more extensive, disturbing narrative. As they combed through evidence from both Harris's and Caldwell's cases, Anderson stumbled upon a series of old police reports dating back several years. These reports detailed a pattern of violence and harassment that had gone unnoticed by the broader community, unresolved cases involving missing persons, and assault that had remained in the shadows for far too long. With each report they read, Anderson's unease grew. The descriptions of the victims, mostly young women, echoed the stories of the phantom killer's victims. The timeline lined up suspiciously, suggesting a potential connection between the cases that could not be ignored. Were there more killers out there? Or was this a singular monster that had managed to slip through the cracks of justice? Anderson and Mason decided to re-examine the cold cases, reaching out to families who had lost loved ones. They knew they had to dig deeper, unearthing secrets buried beneath the town's surface. Their investigation took a turn when they received an anonymous tip regarding a woman named Lydia Monroe, who had gone missing 5 years earlier. Lydia was last seen leaving a local diner late at night. A waitress claimed to have seen her talking to a man who had been a regular at the diner, known for his erratic behavior and history of violent outbursts. The man's name was Jerry Cook, and as Mason and Anderson began to research him, they uncovered a pattern of intimidation that surrounded him. Witnesses described him as a volatile figure, someone who would often show up at social gatherings uninvited, lurking in the background, seemingly waiting for an opportunity to strike. Anderson tracked down a former girlfriend of Cook's, hoping to gain insight into his character. The woman, visibly shaken by the memories, recounted how Jerry had been charming at first, but had quickly become possessive and aggressive. She spoke of his jealous rages, the threats he had made against her friends, and the chilling conversations they'd had about violence. It was evident that Cook had a dark side that had been left unchecked. As they pieced together Lydia's last known movements, they discovered that she had been seen leaving the diner with Cook on the night of her disappearance. This revelation sparked a renewed urgency in their investigation. Mason and Anderson confronted Cook at his home on the outskirts of Texarkana. He was evasive, his demeanor defensive as they questioned him about Lydia. Cook denied any involvement in her disappearance, claiming he hadn't seen her since the night she left the diner. However, as they pressed him for details, Cook's facade began to crumble. He became increasingly agitated, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. The more they questioned him, the more erratic his behavior grew. "Why are you asking me this? I don't know anything," he shouted, his voice rising. "You think I'm some kind of monster? I've done nothing wrong." Mason maintained his composure, attempting to de-escalate the situation. "We just want to find out what happened to Lydia. She deserves justice, just like all the other victims." But Cook's temper boiled over, and in a fit of rage he shouted, "You have no idea what you're talking about. I'm not afraid of you. You're the ones who should be scared." The confrontation took a turn for the worse as Cook lunged at them, forcing Mason and Anderson to restrain him. They managed to subdue him without serious injury, but Cook's behavior further fueled their suspicions. They arrested him on suspicion of involvement in Lydia's disappearance, hoping that questioning him would lead to answers. Once in custody, Cook's bravado quickly faded. Under intense questioning, he began to crack. His stories changed, each version of events more bizarre than the last. He initially claimed to have been at home the night Lydia disappeared, then shifted to saying he had seen her, but hadn't spoken to her. Mason and Anderson pressed him, utilizing evidence they had gathered from the diner's surveillance footage, which showed Cook leaving with Lydia that night. Slowly, the pieces began to fit together, revealing a chilling narrative that pointed to his culpability. Under mounting pressure, Cook finally broke down, confessing to having confronted Lydia about something he claimed she had said to a friend. His anger had boiled over, and in a fit of rage, he had lost control. He claimed he had not meant to kill her, that it had just happened, but the details were sketchy and riddled with contradictions. Anderson and Mason listened intently, determined to extract the truth. "What happened after? Where is she?" Mason demanded, his voice steady but firm. Cook's face contorted with guilt and fear. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I panicked. I didn't know what to do," he stammered. As the interrogation continued, Cook revealed that he had disposed of Lydia's body in a remote area outside of town, fearing the consequences of his actions. He led them to the site, an abandoned lot surrounded by dense woods and overgrown vegetation. Mason, Anderson, and a team of officers followed Cook to the location. As they scoured the area, anxiety weighed heavily on everyone involved. Emma had been informed of the potential breakthrough in the case, and she chose to join them, hoping to find closure for the families affected by the violence. When they reached the site, Cook's demeanor shifted again. He became evasive, refusing to give precise directions. Frustrated, Mason shouted, "We need to find her! Help us!" Cook's resolve crumbled under the pressure. "I buried her out there," he cried, pointing vaguely into the trees. "Just don't hurt me! Please!" The officers fanned out, scouring the area where Cook had indicated. It wasn't long before they unearthed something, an unmarked grave, concealed beneath a blanket of leaves and debris. Heart pounding, Anderson knelt beside the site, knowing they were on the brink of revealing a truth that had long been buried. As the ground was cleared, the reality of the moment hit hard. When the remains were finally revealed, the weight of sorrow settled heavily upon the search party. The discovery of Lydia Monroe's body marked a tragic turning point, a somber reminder of the lives lost to violence in Texarkana. With Lydia's identification confirmed, the news of her death sent shockwaves through the community. The darkness that had plagued Texarkana for so long felt palpable as families came together to mourn her loss. Vigils were held, and the town united in remembrance of Lydia and all the victims who had suffered at the hands of violence. Emma was deeply affected by Lydia's story. She felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility to honor her memory, to ensure that no other families would have to endure such pain. She threw herself into her advocacy work, organizing events to raise awareness about violence and support for survivors. The community rallied behind her, eager to heal the wounds that had festered for far too long. Anderson and Mason continued their investigation, determined to connect the dots between Lydia's case and the Phantom Killer. They delved deeper into Cook's past, uncovering a disturbing history of aggression and violence that had gone unnoticed for years. Cook's behavior revealed a pattern. He wasn't just a lone wolf. He had a network of associates who had enabled his actions. As they examined the relationships Cook had formed, Mason and Anderson began to identify other potential suspects, men with similar violent tendencies who had been overlooked in the initial investigations. They followed leads, tracking down individuals who had been connected to Cook in the past. Each new discovery painted a chilling picture of a community plagued by darkness, where violence had become a hidden reality. The pressure mounted as the investigation progressed. Cook's trial approached, and public sentiment began to shift. The community demanded answers, seeking justice for Lydia and all the victims whose stories had gone unheard. Emma became a beacon of hope, rallying support for victims' families and calling for systemic changes to prevent future violence. With each passing day, the truth felt closer, but the tension in Texarkana was palpable. Mason and Anderson knew that the shadows of the past would not easily fade. As they navigated the complexities of the investigation, they realized that the fight for justice would not only be a battle against individuals like Cook, but also against a culture that had allowed violence to thrive unchecked. The atmosphere in Texarkana was thick with tension as the trial of Jerry Cook approached. With each passing day, the community braced itself for the revelations that would follow. Emma, Sheriff Mason, and Ranger Anderson stood on the precipice of uncovering the full extent of the violence that had plagued their town, determined to bring justice to the victims and their families. As the trial loomed, Emma organized a series of community meetings aimed at educating residents about violence and prevention strategies. She knew that it was crucial for the town to come together, to confront the shadows of the past, and to foster a sense of unity in the face of adversity. The meetings were attended by local leaders, activists, and families who had been directly affected by the violence. In one particular session, Emma shared her own story, recounting her harrowing experience during the attack. Her voice trembled, but she spoke with conviction. "We cannot allow fear to dictate our lives. We must support each other, listen to one another, and take a stand against violence in all its forms. The room filled with a palpable energy, a mix of grief and determination. As people shared their own stories, it became clear that Texarkana was ready to confront its demons. They began to discuss practical measures, neighborhood watch programs, self-defense classes, and mental health resources. The atmosphere shifted from despair to empowerment, as community members vowed to work together to create a safer environment. As the trial began, the courtroom was packed with reporters, victims' families, and residents eager to witness the proceedings. The tension was thick. You could feel the weight of the moment hanging in the air. Emma sat in the front row, flanked by friends and family members of other victims, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. Prosecutors presented their case against Cook, detailing the events leading up to Lydia Monroe's disappearance and the chilling confessions he had made during interrogation. The evidence was compelling, but Cook's defense team was determined to sow doubt. They painted him as a troubled man pushed to his limits, claiming that he hadn't meant to kill Lydia, that it had been an accident. The testimony of witnesses was harrowing. Friends of Lydia spoke of her vibrant spirit, her dreams, and the tragedy of her untimely death. Emma listened intently, feeling the pain of the families around her. Each testimony was a reminder of the lives cut short, the future stolen. When Cook took the stand, he presented a distorted narrative of the night Lydia disappeared. He claimed that she had provoked him, that he had been justified in his actions. Emma felt a surge of anger as he twisted the truth, desperately trying to paint himself as a victim. Mason and Anderson watched closely, knowing that they needed to present their evidence against Cook. They were determined to expose the truth, to show the jury that Cook was not a victim. He was a predator. As the trial progressed, Mason and Anderson dug deeper into Cook's past, uncovering more disturbing details about his life. They discovered that he had a history of violent behavior and had been involved in several altercations in the years leading up to Lydia's death. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of a man who thrived on chaos and intimidation. In the course of their investigation, they encountered several individuals who had been victimized by Cook in the past, women who had experienced harassment, stalking, and violence at his hands. They were hesitant to come forward, fearing retribution, but Mason and Anderson assured them that they were there to help. Through interviews, they gathered enough testimonies to demonstrate a clear pattern of Cook's behavior. They presented these accounts during the trial, drawing parallels between Cook's previous actions and the tragic events surrounding Lydia's disappearance. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief as more women came forward, adding to the mounting evidence against him. The turning point came when one brave woman stepped forward to testify about her own experience with Cook. Her voice shook as she recounted the night he had cornered her in a dark alley, threatening her with violence. Her courage resonated deeply, igniting a fire in the hearts of those who had suffered in silence. As the trial reached its climax, the prosecution made their final arguments. Emma sat in the front row, holding her breath, her heart pounding as they detailed the pain and suffering caused by Cook's actions. The attorney spoke passionately, reminding the jury of the lives lost, the families shattered, and the fear that had gripped the community. Gerald Cook is not a victim. He is a man who chose to take a life, the prosecutor asserted, his voice steady and commanding. He must be held accountable for his actions, not only for Lydia Monroe, but for every person he has harmed. The jury deliberated for hours, and as the clock ticked away, anxiety surged in the courtroom. Emma clutched the hands of those around her, feeling a mix of hope and dread. After what felt like an eternity, the jury finally returned, and the tension was palpable. When the foreman announced the verdict, guilty on all counts, an overwhelming wave of emotion flooded through the room. Emma's heart soared as tears of relief streamed down her face. The families of the victims embraced one another, finding solace in the knowledge that justice had been served. Cook was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away in handcuffs, a mix of anger and satisfaction coursed through the courtroom. Emma felt a sense of closure, knowing that Lydia's story would not be forgotten. Her memory would live on, inspiring others to speak out against violence and to advocate for change. The community of Texarkana began to heal. Emma continued her advocacy work, now with a renewed sense of purpose. She organized more support groups, ensuring that those affected by violence had a safe space to share their experiences. The town embraced her leadership, and together they worked to implement programs aimed at prevention and education. Sheriff Mason and Ranger Anderson remained vigilant, committed to safeguarding the town and addressing the systemic issues that had allowed violence to persist. They collaborated with local organizations to improve response protocols and increase awareness around safety measures. The bonds formed during the investigation strengthened their resolve to create a safer Texarkana. As months passed, the community worked to rebuild trust and resilience. Neighborhood watch programs flourished, and self-defense classes gained popularity. Emma became a prominent voice in these initiatives, leading workshops and speaking at events to empower individuals to take control of their safety. The local media began to highlight positive stories of community members coming together to support one another, showcasing acts of kindness and solidarity. The narrative around Texarkana began to shift from one of fear to one of hope and healing. But even as the town moved forward, the scars of the past remained. Emma and the families of the victims continued to grapple with their grief, finding solace in their shared experiences. They honored their loved ones through annual memorials, ensuring that the stories of those lost to violence were never forgotten. Just when the community began to find peace, a chilling revelation emerged. During an unrelated investigation, detectives stumbled upon evidence that suggested Cook was not the only predator in Texarkana. A series of cold cases, many involving missing women, had remained unsolved for years, and new evidence linked them to a larger network of violence. Mason and Anderson felt a sense of urgency as they began to connect the dots, realizing that they had only scratched the surface of the darkness that lurked beneath the town's surface. As they delved deeper, they uncovered connections between Cook and several other men known for their violent behaviors. The more they investigated, the more disturbing patterns emerged. Individuals who had gone unnoticed, living in the shadows, preying on the vulnerable. The fight for justice was far from over, and Emma was determined to stand at the forefront of this new battle. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Emma rallied the community once more. She organized town hall meetings, inviting law enforcement, mental health professionals, and advocates to discuss the alarming findings. Together, they formed task forces to tackle the issues head-on, focusing on prevention, education, and victim support. As discussions unfolded, the community began to recognize the importance of addressing the underlying issues that had allowed violence to flourish. They initiated partnerships with local schools, providing resources to educate young people about healthy relationships, consent, and self-defense. Emma's voice became a beacon of hope for many, inspiring a renewed commitment to combat violence in all its forms. The community of Texarkana began to reclaim their narrative, transforming fear into action. As the seasons changed, so too did Texarkana. The town that had once been gripped by fear now stood united against violence. The stories of victims were no longer whispered in the shadows. They were celebrated and honored, their legacies serving as reminders of the resilience of the human spirit. Emma reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had transformed her pain into purpose, advocating for change and supporting those who had been affected by violence. The road ahead was still challenging, but she felt a renewed sense of hope and determination. With the community standing behind her, Emma knew that together they could make a difference. The shadows of the past would always linger, but the light of unity, love, and resilience shone brighter than ever. As she stood at the forefront of the fight for justice, Emma understood that the battle against violence was ongoing. But she also knew that they were not alone. Texarkana had become a community bound by strength and compassion, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead.